Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In the freezing days of January 1925, the barren valleys and moss-covered hills of southwestern Kentucky were blanketed in snow. This region was known in the U.S. as cave country. Beneath the surface stretched thousands of kilometers of limestone tunnels, holding traces of a mysterious world. For the locals, these caves were not just natural wonders, but also a source of livelihood. The area had started to attract tourists, especially because of massive cave systems like Mammoth Cave. Floyd Collins was born and raised in this rocky landscape. He was a man who understood the language of caves and could move freely through narrow passages. At 37, he had spent almost his entire life underground. The thrill he felt as a child, crawling through muddy, tight corridors with his hands covered in dirt, had never left him. For Floyd, darkness wasn't something to fear. It was a secret waiting to be uncovered. His family had once operated a cave called Crystal Cave, but over time, the venture failed to bring in enough money. The larger caves in the region were under the control of major tourism companies. Yet Floyd still held on to a flicker of hope. If he could discover a large, unexplored cave, he might be able to open it to tourism himself and secure financial independence for his family. Driven by this dream, he set his sights on a narrow and dangerous cave nearby called Sand Cave. Though less known, it had the potential to be a gateway to a vast underground system. However, its tight tunnels, slippery walls, and constant risk of collapse made it extremely hazardous. Still, to Floyd, the risk was outweighed by the desire to fulfill a lifelong dream. On the morning of January 30th, before the first light of day touched the ground, Floyd arrived at the mouth of the cave with only a lamp, some food, and a few ropes. He wore a thick coat, had a small pickaxe at his waist, and a familiar determination in his eyes. As he slipped into the narrow entrance of Sand Cave, one thought echoed in his mind. This time it will happen. This time, I'll truly find it. But the underground world does not give up its secrets easily. The morning of January 30th, 1925. The air was cold, the ground frozen. Floyd Collins had completed his preparations the day before. He had mentally traced his route through the cave over and over again. Dressed in heavy work clothes with ropes tied around his waist, a few snacks in his pockets, and only a carbide lamp to light his way, he reached the cave entrance before sunrise and entered without hesitation. True to its name, Sand Cave had a loose surface, a high risk of collapse, was damp, and incredibly narrow. Some passages were so tight that one had to squeeze through while holding their breath. Floyd crawled through these narrow corridors, scraping his back against the overhead rocks, cutting his elbows, and leaving his breath hanging in the cold, dense air. As he descended deeper, the only light was from his flickering lamp. With every meter, the ground became slicker, the air heavier. But these conditions were nothing new to Floyd. He had explored similar tunnels many times. What truly challenged him was the unknown and the tightness of the cave. At about 55 feet, 17 meters, deep, he paused. To his left, he noticed a peculiar rock formation. It could be the sign of a larger chamber ahead. But time moves differently underground. Breath shortens. Realizing he had gone deep enough, Floyd decided to turn back. He began to crawl back through the tunnel. Just as he was passing through a particularly narrow passage, a rock above, loosened by the shifting sand, suddenly moved. There was a faint cracking sound. Instinctively, he tried to pull back, but a stone slab fell, pinning his right leg. It all happened in an instant. The weight and position of the rock were critical. He couldn't move, but he wasn't completely crushed either. Floyd tried to pull his leg out. The rock wouldn't budge. He leaned against the cave wall, trying to control his breath. His only source of light was his lamp, and the carbide was slowly running out. He had a slice of bread and a bit of water. But the greatest lack was sound. There wasn't a single echo that could reach the world above. Outside, no one yet knew he was missing. As tears ran down his face and his lips trembled, He whispered, "God, I'm going to get out of here, right?" Floyd Collins, trapped underground, was caught between human will and the power of nature. Time had slowed for him, but above, the clock kept ticking. On the morning of January 31st, Floyd's failure to return home had begun to worry his family. Spending the night in the cave was unusual for him. This concern led his brother, Homer Collins, to set out for Sand Cave, filled with unease. When Homer arrived at the cave entrance, there was no sound from within. However, knowing his brother's determination and passion for caves, Homer entered, cautiously without panic. He followed the crawling marks on the ground, pushing forward. But the narrow passages of Sand Cave were too tight for most people. After hours of effort, Homer finally reached the depths of the cave and heard a faint echo. "I'm here!" This thin, weak voice was the echo of hope, bouncing off the cave walls. Floyd was alive, tired but alive. Homer immediately turned back and called for help. Soon, locals, volunteers, miners, and authorities gathered at the entrance. Everyone wanted to help, but the problem was huge. The spot where Floyd was trapped was so narrow that rescue equipment couldn't be lowered there. Only slender people could reach the spot, and even they struggled to move through the stones and mud. Rescue efforts quickly brought in ropes, shovels, and lanterns. Food and warm drinks were attempted to be sent down to Floyd. But the weather was growing colder. The underground temperature was nearing freezing during the night hours. The media interest didn't take long to arrive. Local reporter William Skeets Miller was one of the few to enter the cave. With his slender build, he managed to squeeze through the narrow tunnels and reach Floyd, speaking with him. Those moments made nationwide headlines. Every word Skeets reported turned into front-page news. Floyd is still alive. Rescue efforts continue. Race against time. Within a few days, the area around Sand Cave had transformed into a campsite. Hundreds of people, curious onlookers, journalists, vendors, and even opportunists gathered. Campfires were lit, food was distributed, and outside, it felt almost like a carnival. But inside the cave, one man was waiting alone, trapped beneath a stone, facing his fate. A few people who managed to reach Floyd reported that he was still hopeful. His face was covered in mud, his hands were frozen, but he could still speak, smile, and say, "I will get out of here." These words deeply affected everyone in the outside world. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol for the entire country, a figure everyone prayed for. However, as time went on, the cave became more treacherous. The tunnels narrowed, collapses began. With every passing hour, the echo of hope grew weaker. News of Floyd Collins being trapped in Sand Cave soon spread beyond the local borders. First, regional newspapers reported the story, and then national agencies like the Associated Press got involved. Within days, journalists from all across America flocked to rural Kentucky. Articles written under the flickering light of gas lamps were published in the morning editions with headlines such as, "Explorer Buried Alive," "The Hero Inside the Cave." Radios, for the first time, broadcasted this event live to the public. Radio was a new medium, and Floyd's struggle became one of its first major tragedies. People sat at home, eagerly listening as they followed the fate of the man trapped in a faraway cave. Journalists, instead of standing with pen and notebook, now stood by the cave entrance with microphones and cameras. But over time, this attention began to overshadow the essence of the tragedy. The area around Sand Cave turned into a spectacle. Food and drink vendors, people taking souvenir photos, and sellers of memorabilia. On one side, the life and death struggle continued, while on the other, people sipped their warm coffee, watching the unfolding events. Floyd Collins was no longer just a cave explorer. He had become the central figure of a tragedy shaped by the media. Meanwhile, the conditions inside the cave were worsening. The temperatures had dropped below freezing at night. The mud inside had frozen, turning narrow passages into ice-ridden tunnels mixed with stone. Several volunteers who had previously reached Floyd were now unable to get inside. Every movement could cause the tunnel to collapse completely. During some of the rescue attempts, Ceiling rocks broke loose, blocking the narrow passages, and the paths began to close. The last person to reach Floyd was once again the journalist Skeets Miller. According to his report, Floyd's voice had weakened, but he was still speaking, still trying to joke. This resilience kept the hope of the outside world alive. However, the rescue efforts had reached a deadlock. It was nearly impossible to progress through the narrow tunnel. As a result, the rescue team came up with a new plan. A new tunnel would be dug from the top of the cave. This vertical shaft was intended to reach directly to the spot where Floyd was trapped. But this method required more time and manpower. The soil was not soft, machinery was struggling, and the weather was growing harsher by the day. The rescue area had now become not just a campsite but the center of a nationwide test of patience, hope, and sorrow. But shadows were growing heavier. With every passing hour, the light of life below the surface dimmed, and the flashes of journalists' cameras couldn't cover the pain. Floyd's name was now associated with more than just courage. It had become synonymous with a race against time, a tragedy. By February 5th, the echoes from inside Sand Cave had begun to weaken. After days of effort, the rescue team was exhausted but still hopeful. The digging of the new vertical tunnel continued, while several people simultaneously tried to keep the narrow passages open. But time had become an open enemy. Journalist Skeets Miller tried once again to descend into the cave on the morning of February 5th. After great difficulty, he managed to reach Floyd's location. He called out, and there was a moment of silence. Then he heard the faint response, echoing one last time. "I'm here." Floyd's voice was slower and trembled this time, but he was still alive. Miller spoke a few more words before exiting. The next day, when he tried again, the narrow passage had collapsed. Floyd's voice was never heard again. The collapse had not only buried the rocks but also buried all hope. The pressure inside the cave had increased, and the mixture of mud and rocks had shifted. The newly opened passages were completely blocked. It was now physically impossible to reach Floyd's location. The voice tubes and food lines had all been severed. No response came from below. Floyd was there, but he was now completely silent. Above, the atmosphere in the camp suddenly changed. The carnival atmosphere dispersed. People slowly began to leave quietly. The rescue teams had begun to accept the truth internally, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. The excavation work did not stop. Everyone still hoped for a miraculous reach. But as time went on, the soil resisted more, and the rock layers grew more stubborn. Finally, on February 16, 1925, after 13 days of struggle, the newly opened tunnel reached Floyd's location, but it was too late. Floyd's body was motionless. His clothes were covered in frozen mud, and his face was turned toward the stones. The cause of death was likely hypothermia and dehydration. For 13 days he had been underground, in the dark, in the cold, alone. In his final days, no one had been with him, and his voice had failed to reach anyone. Life had silently withdrawn from him. The rescue team remained still for a few minutes inside the cave. None of them looked at each other. It was as if there was not a body lying there, but the innocence of an era. Floyd Collins's story was no longer just a rescue attempt. It had become a symbol of human will, helplessness, and the echo of silence. After Floyd Collins's death, the inside of the cave was once again engulfed in silence. But this silence was temporary. The rescue team now faced a new decision. Should they leave Floyd's body there, or should they bring it out and deliver it to his family? The ground was so unstable that removing the body without causing harm was risky. The danger of collapse still persisted. Eventually, as a temporary solution, the spot where Floyd's body lay was sealed with stones and rubble, creating an underground tomb. A sign was placed at the cave's entrance. "Floyd lies here." However, his family did not settle for this decision. When spring arrived and the weather improved, a new team was formed to retrieve the body. This time, the process was more organized. Finally, 60 days after his death, Floyd's body was removed from Sand Cave. Floyd's remains were placed in a grave prepared in another cave called Crystal Cave, which was privately owned by the Collins family. However, this would not be the place where he would find peace. Over the years, Crystal Cave became a tourist attraction. The family would tell visitors about Floyd's story and organize tours to his grave. Over time, the grave was encased in a glass coffin and began to be exhibited inside the cave. Even after his death, Floyd Collins was still introducing people to caves and drawing tourists. However, in 1927, this was not enough. Floyd's body was stolen. The grave was opened, the glass coffin was shattered, and the skeleton was removed. Authorities launched a large-scale search, and a few days later, Floyd's remains were found in a nearby field. His left leg was missing. The incident caused a public uproar. In response, his family requested that the body be moved to a more secure grave. However, it was still within Crystal Cave. Floyd's remains remained inside the cave until 1961. Finally, at the request of the Collins family, in 1989, the body was removed from the cave and buried in the family cemetery in Flint Ridge, alongside other relatives. This time, it was hoped that he would truly find peace. Floyd Collins's tragedy was not just a story of being trapped in a cave. What happened to him became engraved in the collective memory of the public. It was the first time that the media had so clearly demonstrated how it could magnify events and turn a tragedy into a spectacle. Journalists, radios, and public curiosity all combined to transform the death of one man into a nationwide legend. And thus, Floyd Collins became not just a cave explorer, but a legend echoing in the silence of the underground, one of the first tragic heroes of the media age. Today, his name is still whispered in the dark corridors of Sand Cave. Buried beneath the rocks was not just a body but the faith, hope, and tragedy of an era that blended with the soil.